Hands up! Why are you driving this car?
Driving. Officer, I own this car. What is the problem?
You fit the description of a suspect driving a car matching this make and color.
That is profiling. My registration and ID are in the console.
Don't reach. Keep your hands where I can see them.
I'm trying to comply, but you need to verify.
Officer Derek Sullivan had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 14 years. In those 14 years, he'd accumulated 27 formal complaints. 23 of them involved black women he'd pulled over without legitimate traffic violations in affluent areas of the city. A black businesswoman in a Mercedes was stopped for suspicious driving pattern. A black doctor in a BMW was detained for improper lane change that dashcam footage later disproved. A black attorney driving home from court was searched for drugs during a routine stop with no violation. A black professor in a Lexus was handcuffed for matching a description that was never verified. A black executive was arrested for resisting when she asked for the reason for the stop. A black nurse driving to work was detained for erratic driving when she was going the speed limit. Every complaint ended the same way: internal affairs review that cleared him, use of force justification that protected him, bias training he attended but dismissed, union grievances that blocked discipline, written warnings that accumulated in a file nobody acted on. One Wednesday afternoon in Atlanta, his 14-year pattern of pretextual stops targeting black women in expensive cars finally confronted someone who didn't just know the law, someone who prosecuted federal crimes for a living, had spent years in courtrooms dismantling weak cases built on racial profiling, reported directly to the U.S. attorney, and had authority that made Sullivan look like exactly what he was: a rogue officer who'd been protected for far too long. That confrontation would end Sullivan's career, cost the city $3.2 million, create a regional scandal, and expose a department that had ignored 27 complaints over 14 years. Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper, a 39-year-old federal prosecutor, was driving through Buckhead after a court hearing when she saw flashing lights behind her. Her federal credentials were in her purse, her bar card in her wallet, her case files in her briefcase on the passenger seat. No traffic violation, no erratic driving, no legitimate reason for the stop, just a federal prosecutor driving through an upscale neighborhood. But Officer Sullivan saw her through a lens so warped by racial assumptions and gender bias that he couldn't process a black woman in a luxury car as anything other than suspicious, certainly not as a federal law enforcement official, and definitely not as someone who could dismantle his career with her legal expertise. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Hit that subscribe button. These stories expose the truth. Atlanta, Georgia. Buckhead, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the Southeast with luxury shopping, high-rise condominiums, and upscale restaurants. The area was known for expensive cars, wealthy residents, and heavy police presence. It was 3:15 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, temperature 78 degrees. Sunny skies. Traffic was moderate as the workday continued. Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper had been with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia for 10 years, prosecuting federal crimes in the criminal division. She'd graduated from Spelman College summa cum laude, then Yale Law School, where she'd been an editor of the Yale Law Journal. She'd clerked for a federal district judge, worked as a public defender for 3 years to understand criminal defense, then joined the U.S. Attorney's Office where she prosecuted federal crimes: public corruption, civil rights violations, organized crime, financial fraud, violent crimes. She'd argued before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, won convictions against corrupt officials and violent criminals, supervised junior prosecutors. She'd received the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service twice. She specialized in prosecuting civil rights violations under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 242, including cases involving law enforcement officers who abused their authority. Just 3 weeks earlier, she'd secured a conviction against a police officer who'd conducted illegal searches during pretextual traffic stops. The irony of what was about to happen would haunt her for months. That afternoon, Nicole had just left federal court after a sentencing hearing in a corruption case. She'd successfully argued for a substantial sentence against a city councilman who'd embezzled public funds. She was driving back to her office in her Audi A6, obeying all the traffic laws, when she noticed a patrol car following her for several blocks. She checked her speed, 33 in a 35 mph zone. She'd signaled every turn. She'd stopped completely at stop signs. Then the lights came on. Do you think officers should state violations immediately during traffic stops? Drop your answer below. Officer Derek Sullivan had those 27 complaints over 14 years. 23 involved black women in wealthy neighborhoods, a pattern so undeniable it should have ended his career a decade ago. But Atlanta PD treated each complaint in isolation, never acknowledging the systematic bias and gender discrimination staring them in the face. Sullivan's supervisors had recommended termination 3 times. Internal Affairs had flagged him as high risk. Community groups, specifically black women's organizations, had protested his assignments and demanded his removal. Yet he remained on patrol because the police union had successfully blocked every disciplinary action, and the department valued union relationships over public safety. His personnel file contained documented evidence of bias against black women specifically, yet he remained on patrol with full arrest authority. That afternoon, Sullivan was patrolling Buckhead when he saw a black woman driving an Audi with tinted windows. No traffic violation occurred, but Sullivan followed her for 8 blocks, looking for any reason to justify a stop. When none materialized, he pulled her over. Anyway, planning to claim suspicious driving behavior in his report, a tactic he'd used dozens of times before. Nicole pulled over carefully, put her car in park, turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and took a deep breath. She'd prosecuted enough cases involving traffic stops to know the risks. She'd reviewed dashcam footage of stops gone wrong. She'd read autopsy reports. She'd heard families testify. She kept her hands visible and waited. Sullivan approached the driver's window with aggressive body language, his hand already resting on his weapon in a manner designed to intimidate. "Ma'am, pull over immediately." Nicole spoke calmly and professionally. "Officer, I have pulled over. Can you tell me why you're stopping me?" "License and registration. Don't ask questions." Nicole's prosecutorial training kicked in immediately. "Officer, I have a right to know the reason for the stop. I'm asking respectfully. What traffic violation did I commit?" Sullivan's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle right now." "I'd like to know the legal basis for this stop first. I was traveling below the speed limit. I signaled all turns. I stopped at all stop signs and lights. What is the specific violation?" "You're under arrest for failure to comply." Nicole remained absolutely calm, knowing every word mattered. "Officer, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper, Northern District of Georgia. My credentials are in my purse on the passenger seat. My badge is in my wallet. I'm a federal prosecutor. I'm going to slowly reach for my credentials. I'm not armed. I prosecute federal crimes for the Department of Justice." Sullivan sneered, his contempt visible. "Sure you are. Everyone's a lawyer when they get pulled over. Step out of the vehicle immediately." "I'm serious, officer. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney. I specialize in prosecuting civil rights violations. You can verify through APD Dispatch or the U.S. Attorney's Office. Call the main number, 404-581-6000. What you're doing right now is an unlawful detention of a federal official without legal basis. Last warning. Out of the car or I'm pulling you out." Nicole pulled out her phone with one hand while keeping the other on the wheel. "I'm activating my recording. Officer Sullivan, badge number 3764, Atlanta Police Department, has pulled me over without stating a traffic violation. I've identified myself as Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper. I'm a federal prosecutor being detained without probable cause or reasonable suspicion. Should officers face federal charges for arresting federal prosecutors? Let me know what you think." Sullivan opened the door forcefully. "You're under arrest for obstruction, resisting arrest, and impersonating a federal officer." "Impersonating? I am a federal officer. This is a catastrophic mistake, Officer Sullivan." Sullivan grabbed Nicole's arm and pulled her out of the vehicle roughly. Nicole didn't resist physically but spoke clearly and firmly for her recording and for passing motorists who'd slowed to watch. "I am not resisting. I am complying under protest. I am Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper, Northern District of Georgia, Criminal Division. I prosecute federal crimes, including civil rights violations by law enforcement. I am being unlawfully arrested by Atlanta PD Officer Derek Sullivan. I have committed no traffic violation, no crime, no obstruction. This is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights and potentially a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 242. Motorists were stopping now, pulling out phones to record. "That's wrong," one shouted. "She said she's a federal prosecutor," another yelled. Sullivan handcuffed Nicole, the metal tight on her wrists, tighter than necessary. He walked her toward the patrol car while Nicole continued documenting in a calm, prosecutorial voice. I am a 10-year veteran federal prosecutor. I report to the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. I was driving from federal court back to my office. Officer Sullivan pulled me over without stating a violation. I identified myself as a federal prosecutor. He's arresting me for driving while black and female in Buckhead. I have witnesses. I have video evidence. The time is 3:27 p.m. This is Patrol Unit 558. My credentials are in my vehicle. This will be a career-ending mistake for this officer and a constitutional crisis for Atlanta PD. Sullivan placed her in the back of the patrol car roughly, pushing her head down harder than necessary. Through the window, Nicole could see her Audi with the door open, her briefcase visible on the seat containing sensitive federal case files about ongoing investigations, her federal credentials in her purse. She was mentally cataloging every violation: unlawful stop without reasonable suspicion, false arrest without probable cause, assault on a federal official, deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice for detaining a federal prosecutor, failure to verify credentials, and the mounting federal implications of arresting an assistant U.S. attorney. The drive to the station took 23 minutes through Atlanta traffic. Nicole spent every minute of it thinking about the federal cases she was prosecuting, the press conference the U.S. attorney would have to give, the DOJ investigation that would follow, the constitutional implications, and the reforms this incident would force not just in Atlanta but potentially across the country. They arrived at Atlanta PD's Zone 2 headquarters. Sullivan walked her inside, still handcuffed, past a desk sergeant who looked up and froze, his face going pale with recognition. Sullivan. What? Ms. Harper? You're from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I saw you at the law enforcement briefing last month. Nicole spoke before Sullivan could. Sergeant, I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper, Criminal Division, Northern District of Georgia. I was driving from federal court after a sentencing hearing when Officer Sullivan pulled me over without stating a traffic violation. I identified myself as a federal prosecutor. He arrested me for impersonation. My credentials are in my vehicle. My bar card is in my wallet. I need you to contact U.S. Attorney James Morrison immediately. His direct line is 404-581-6010. This is a federal matter. This is Code Red. The sergeant was already reaching for the phone, his hands shaking. Ms. Harper, I recognize you from the corruption task force. Oh God. Sullivan, what have you done? Sullivan still didn't grasp the magnitude. She claims she's a federal prosecutor, but she is a federal prosecutor. She prosecuted the Councilman case. She spoke at our civil rights training. She's in the papers. The sergeant was dialing the U.S. Attorney's direct line, his voice panicked. Within minutes, the situation exploded. U.S. Attorney James Morrison was on the phone, his voice audible even from across the room, demanding to know how one of his prosecutors had been arrested. Within 10 minutes, Morrison arrived at the station personally with 2 FBI agents. Within 15 minutes, the mayor's office had been notified. Within 20 minutes, the Georgia Attorney General's office was involved. Within 30 minutes, every federal prosecutor in the Northern District knew what had happened. Within an hour, the story was breaking nationally with legal experts expressing shock. U.S. Attorney Morrison approached Nicole, who was still handcuffed in an interview room, and removed the handcuffs himself, his face a mixture of fury and deep concern. Nicole, I cannot express how sorry I am. This is unconscionable. You're being released immediately. This arrest never should have happened. He turned to Sullivan, his voice shaking with controlled rage. You arrested a federal prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney who prosecutes civil rights violations. You ignored her credentials. You accused her of impersonation. You committed a federal crime. The Atlanta police chief rushed in moments later. Ms. Harper, on behalf of Atlanta PD, I am profoundly sorry. This is indefensible. He turned to Sullivan. Badge and weapon. You're suspended without pay immediately, pending termination and federal charges. The FBI will want to speak with you. The DOJ Civil Rights Division will investigate. Do not leave the state. Sullivan finally understood, his face draining of color. Chief, I didn't know. You arrested a federal prosecutor. She told you repeatedly. She offered to let you verify. You ignored everything. You've generated 27 complaints in 14 years, 23 involving black women. Supervisors recommended your termination multiple times. And now you've arrested a sitting assistant U.S. attorney who prosecutes the exact crimes you just committed. Your career is over. Federal charges are coming. Badge, weapon, now. By that evening, the story had exploded nationally and internationally. Every major news outlet led with it. A black female federal prosecutor arrested during a traffic stop while driving from court. The optics were devastating. The legal implications were staggering. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement condemning the arrest. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division announced an immediate investigation. The FBI opened a federal criminal case. National civil rights organizations, women's legal associations, and prosecutors' groups demanded systemic reform. Video from witnesses went viral, showing a professional black woman in business attire being handcuffed. The hashtag #FodgeJustice for Prosecutor Harper trended for days. Nicole held a press conference the next day, still processing the trauma but maintaining her prosecutorial composure. I've been a federal prosecutor for 10 years. I've spent my career in courtrooms prosecuting criminals, including law enforcement officers who violate civil rights. Yesterday, I became a victim of exactly what I prosecute. Officer Sullivan saw a black woman in a nice car and assumed crime. He didn't see a colleague in law enforcement. He didn't see a federal prosecutor. He saw what his biases told him to see. And even when I identified myself with specific details about my position, he didn't believe me because he couldn't conceive that a black woman could be an assistant U.S. attorney. Nicole filed a comprehensive federal lawsuit 16 months later against Officer Derek Sullivan individually, his supervisors who'd ignored 27 complaints, Atlanta PD, the City of Atlanta, and the police union for blocking disciplinary action. The lawsuit was filed in federal court and included unprecedented causes of action: unlawful traffic stop of a federal official without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, false arrest of an assistant U.S. attorney in violation of the Fourth Amendment, false imprisonment of a federal prosecutor, assault and battery on a federal law enforcement official, deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of 18 U.S.C., paragraph 242, interference with federal prosecutorial duties, obstruction of justice, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, racial profiling and discrimination in violation of the 14th Amendment, gender-based discrimination, intentional infliction of emotional distress on a federal law enforcement officer, deliberate indifference to Sullivan's pattern of violations specifically targeting black women, failure to train and supervise despite documented complaints, municipal liability for maintaining policies that enabled racial profiling and gender bias, respondent superior liability, damage to professional reputation of a federal prosecutor. The complaint included Sullivan's complete disciplinary record: 27 complaints over 14 years, 23 involving black women in affluent areas, multiple supervisor recommendations for termination blocked by the union, internal affairs flags identifying him as high risk, community complaints specifically noting his pattern of targeting black women, and evidence that Atlanta PD had documented the problem but failed to act due to union pressure. The filing included declarations from other federal prosecutors, expert testimony on constitutional policing and gender bias in policing, statistical analysis of Sullivan's stop patterns showing clear racial and gender disparities, and documentation of the professional harm to Nicole's reputation and psychological well-being. Atlanta's city attorneys initially tried to mount a defense, but quickly realized the case was politically and legally indefensible. Dashboard camera footage from Sullivan's patrol car showed no traffic violation. Body camera footage showed Nicole complying with all commands while Sullivan escalated unnecessarily. Witnesses confirmed her account. Video evidence from multiple sources existed. Sullivan had zero legal basis for the stop and zero probable cause for the arrest. The credentials and bar card were exactly where Nicole said they'd be. The pattern of complaints showed deliberate indifference rising to constitutional violations and specifically targeted black women. The involvement of a federal prosecutor added unprecedented aggravating factors. Atlanta's own internal affairs reports documented that Sullivan should have been terminated years earlier. The union's role in blocking discipline created additional liability. The political fallout was immense. The national attention made settlement the only option. The city settled 22 months later, $3.2 million paid to Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper. The settlement also required Atlanta PD to implement sweeping reforms under federal monitoring, including termination of Officer Sullivan with forfeiture of all pension benefits, prohibition on Sullivan ever working in law enforcement again, mandatory DOJ oversight of Atlanta PD's traffic stop practices for 5 years, complete revision of stop policies with specific prohibitions on pretextual stops, automatic investigation triggered by 2 similar complaints within 2 years, body camera and dashboard camera review for every traffic stop, elimination of union contract provisions that blocked discipline for civil rights violations, creation of an independent civilian review board with binding authority, publication of all traffic stop data disaggregated by race and gender, early warning system for officers with complaint patterns and mandatory training on implicit bias and gender bias in policing. Officer Derek Sullivan was terminated 7 weeks after the incident. The termination letter was scathing. Officer Sullivan conducted an unlawful traffic stop of Assistant U.S. Attorney Nicole Harper, a federal prosecutor, without probable cause, reasonable suspicion, or any articulable traffic violation. He arrested a sitting federal law enforcement official for exercising constitutional rights and identifying herself with valid credentials. He ignored clearly stated identification as a federal prosecutor. He accused a federal prosecutor of impersonation. He used excessive force on a federal official. His pattern of similar conduct over 14 years, documented through 27 complaints with 23 involving black women, demonstrates consistent racial profiling and gender bias. Employment terminated immediately for cause with forfeiture of all benefits. Sullivan faced federal criminal charges for deprivation of rights under color of law against a federal official, a felony under 18 U.S.C. Paragraph 242, with enhanced penalties for victimizing a federal law enforcement officer. After extensive negotiations, he pleaded guilty and received 36 months in federal prison, 5 years of supervised release, and a permanent ban from law enforcement nationwide. His name entered the National Decertification Index with special notation that he'd arrested a federal prosecutor. Nicole testified before the Georgia legislature, before Congress, and at a special DOJ roundtable on gender bias in policing. Her testimony was powerful, combining legal expertise with personal trauma. I'm a federal prosecutor. I've dedicated 10 years to prosecuting criminals and protecting civil rights. I've won convictions against corrupt officials and violent criminals. I know the law. I know constitutional rights. I teach other law enforcement officers about proper procedure. And I was arrested for driving while black and female by an officer who couldn't accept that a black woman could be a federal prosecutor. She paused, her voice carrying authority and pain. 27 complaints in 14 years. 23 involving black women in wealthy neighborhoods. Multiple supervisors recommended termination. Internal Affairs flagged him repeatedly. Community groups protested. The union blocked every attempt at discipline. That's not an isolated incident. That's a system designed to protect officers regardless of their conduct, even when they specifically target black women. Officer Sullivan didn't arrest me despite being a federal prosecutor. He arrested me because even being a federal prosecutor couldn't overcome his assumption that a black woman in a nice car must be doing something wrong. She continued, her testimony becoming a national call to action. $3.2 million is what Atlanta taxpayers paid because the system protected a biased officer for 14 years. But money doesn't undo being handcuffed on a public street in my work clothes while returning from court. It doesn't erase the humiliation of being arrested by someone I outrank in the law enforcement hierarchy. It doesn't restore the trust I had in my fellow officers. And it doesn't prevent the next officer with 27 complaints from targeting the next black woman. Because that's the real tragedy. I had credentials, authority, legal expertise, and institutional support. Most victims don't. If this can happen to a federal prosecutor, imagine what happens to everyone else. Atlanta PD's reforms became a national model and were cited in DOJ consent decrees across the country. The case was taught in law schools as a landmark example of systemic bias. Police academies used it as a training example of catastrophic failure at every level. The officer, the supervisors, the union, and the system. Why do departments wait for 27 complaints instead of 2? Why do they ignore patterns specifically targeting black women? Comment your thoughts. This wasn't about one Wednesday afternoon in Buckhead. This was about tolerating Derek Sullivan for 14 years, despite 27 complaints showing systematic racial profiling and gender bias. This was about a union that prioritized protecting a bad officer over protecting the public and federal officials. This was about a system that ignored warnings, blocked discipline, and enabled constitutional violations until the victim was too powerful to dismiss and the cost became impossible to ignore. Sullivan's career is over. He's in federal prison with a felony conviction. His pension is gone. His name is flagged in the National Decertification Index. The city paid $3.2 million. But all of that came after 14 years of ignored warnings, 27 documented complaints, multiple termination recommendations, and a system that protected him until he arrested someone the system couldn't ignore. A federal prosecutor who prosecutes the very crimes he committed. Comment if two similar complaints should trigger automatic investigation and termination regardless of union contracts. Comment if patterns targeting black women specifically should be prosecuted as hate crimes. Comment if federal prosecutors should have immunity from state and local traffic stops. And if you believe these stories matter, if you think the system needs fundamental restructuring, if you believe that 27 complaints over 14 years represents catastrophic failure at every level, then hit that subscribe button. We're exposing departments that ignore documented patterns. We're demanding accountability for supervisors who ignore complaints, unions that block discipline, and systems that enable abuse. This isn't about one officer or one prosecutor. It's about systems so broken that even a federal prosecutor who prosecutes civil rights violations isn't safe from becoming a victim of those same violations.